Hi and welcome to the Archive of History. Tonight we travel to a place that exists between memory and dream, between history and imagination. It is a city that has never been found, yet has been sought for more than 2,000 years. It is an empire that may never have existed, yet its shadow has fallen across every age since antiquity. This is the story of Atlantis, the most famous lost civilization in human history. We will walk its circular streets in our minds. We will stand at the edge of the ancient world and peer beyond the Pillars of Hercules into the mist. We will follow the scholars, the dreamers, and the searchers who have dedicated their lives to finding what may be only a philosopher's invention. Before we drift off, I am always curious to know where my listeners are tuning in from and what time it is that they are listening tonight. Let me know in the comments. And now settle in, let the noise of the modern world fade away. Let us journey back through the corridors of time to a tale first told in Athens, in an academy of marble columns and olive groves, where an old philosopher spoke of an island empire that defied the gods and was swallowed by the sea in a single day and night of misfortune. Our story begins not with Atlantis itself, but with the man who gave the legend to the world. It is a warm afternoon in Athens, in the year 360 before the Common Era. The streets of the Kerameikos district are dusty and alive with the sounds of commerce. Potters work their wheels, their hands shaping clay into graceful amphorae and craters. Merchants haggle over the price of grain brought down from the interior, their voices rising and falling in practiced rhythms of negotiation. The air smells of olive oil being pressed in nearby workshops, warm bread baking in household ovens, and the dry herbs, thyme and oregano and rosemary, that grow wild on the hillsides surrounding the city. The afternoon sun casts long shadows across the paving stones. You walk through these familiar streets toward the northwest edge of the city, past the long colonnades where philosophers and sophists stand delivering lectures to gathered crowds, past the public fountains where women draw water in bronze vessels balanced on their heads, past the small shops where craftsmen ply their trades, metal workers hammering bronze, weavers working looms, cobblers stitching leather sandals. You continue toward a quiet grove of trees beyond the city walls. Here in the shade of ancient plane trees and the sacred olives that have stood for generations, stands the Academy, the school founded by the philosopher Plato nearly 4 decades ago. You pass through the entrance, beneath a simple stone inscription that reads in elegant Greek letters, "Let no one ignorant of geometry enter here." You enter a world dedicated entirely to the pursuit of wisdom and truth, a sanctuary from the noise and chaos of the city. The Academy is not a grand temple or a palace. It is a collection of modest buildings arranged around open courtyards, their walls whitewashed and simple, their roofs tiled in the traditional manner. Students sit in small groups on stone benches, debating questions of ethics and metaphysics. Some recline in the shade of the trees, reading scrolls, their lips moving silently as they work through difficult passages. Others walk slowly along the garden paths, deep in philosophical conversation with their teachers, their hands gesturing expressively as they formulate arguments and counter-arguments. There is a sense of timelessness here, as though the concerns of the city beyond these walls, the political struggles and economic anxieties, belong to a different world entirely. You find Plato himself in one of the smaller rooms, a chamber with whitewashed walls and a window that opens onto a garden of cypress and myrtle. The room is spare but beautiful, furnished only with simple wooden benches and a small table where scrolls lie unfurled, their papyrus yellowed with use. The floor is packed earth, swept clean, and the air smells faintly of beeswax from the tablets the students use for their notes. Plato is an old man now, in his 70s, his face deeply lined by years of thought and study. His long grey beard is carefully groomed, and his eyes, though dimmed somewhat by age, still burn with intellectual intensity. He wears a simple white chiton, the garment of a scholar, and on his feet are plain leather sandals, worn smooth by countless walks through these gardens. He is surrounded by a handful of his most devoted students, young men from wealthy families who have come to Athens to complete their education under the guidance of the city's most famous philosopher. They have gathered to hear him read aloud from a new work, a dialogue he has been composing for many months. The subject, as Plato explains before he begins reading, is the nature of the ideal state, the origins of the cosmos, and the proper education of the guardian class that will rule this ideal society. But today, as the reading begins, you realize that Plato is telling a story within a story, a narrative that seems at first to be a digression, but which will come to dominate the entire dialogue. He is recounting a tale that was told to him, he says, by his great-grandfather, who heard it from the legendary Athenian statesman Solon, who in turn heard it from the priests of Egypt. This elaborate chain of transmission lends the story an air of authenticity, as though it has been carefully preserved and passed down through generations of reliable witnesses. This is how the legend of Atlantis enters the world. Plato's voice is calm and measured as he reads. The dialogue is called Timaeus, and it begins with Socrates, Plato's beloved teacher, who was executed by the Athenian democracy more than 30 years ago, asking his companions to describe the ideal city in action, not merely in theory. He wants to see this perfect state engaged in the struggles of war and diplomacy, to see how its citizens would behave when tested by real challenges. One of the men present, a philosopher named Critias, offers to tell a story that is, he claims, entirely true, not a fiction or a philosophical allegory, but an account of actual historical events. It is a story, he says, that Solon himself brought back from Egypt many years ago. Solon, the great lawgiver of Athens, the man who reformed the city's constitution and laid the foundations for Athenian democracy, had traveled to the ancient city of Sais in the Nile Delta during the period of his self-imposed exile. There, seeking wisdom and knowledge, he spoke with the priests of the goddess Neith, the Egyptian deity who was associated with wisdom and weaving, the patroness of the ancient city. These priests were the most learned men in all of Egypt, the keepers of sacred records that stretched back thousands upon thousands of years far beyond the memory of the Greeks. They were men who had spent their entire lives studying the hieroglyphic inscriptions on temple walls, reading papyrus scrolls that had been copied and recopied through countless generations, preserving knowledge that would otherwise have been lost to time. The priests told Solon, according to Critias, that the Greeks were like children, with no knowledge of the distant past, no written records of the great events that had shaped the world before their time. The Greeks, they said, had forgotten their own history because of the periodic destructions that plague all civilizations, the cycles of catastrophe that periodically wipe clean the slate of human memory. Fires sweep through cities, consuming not just buildings but also the libraries and archives where knowledge is stored. Floods inundate coastal plains, drowning entire populations and washing away all traces of their existence. Plagues decimate civilizations, leaving too few survivors to maintain the complex infrastructure of literate society. Each time such a catastrophe occurs, the survivors are forced to begin again from almost nothing, and within a few generations the memory of what came before fades into legend and myth. But in Egypt, the priests explained, where the Nile's floods are predictable and beneficial rather than destructive, where the climate is stable and the land is protected by deserts on either side, the records have been preserved. The priests told Solon of a time 9,000 years before his visit, a time so remote that it lay beyond the reach of Greek memory, when Athens was a great military power, perhaps the greatest in the known world. In that distant age, according to the Egyptian records, the city was governed by a class of noble warriors who lived apart from the common people, owning no property of their own, holding all things in common, dedicated only to the defense of justice and wisdom. These warriors were the embodiment of Plato's ideal guardians, the philosopher kings who would rule his ideal republic. They lived simply, training constantly in the arts of war, studying philosophy and mathematics, devoting themselves entirely to the service of the state. And it was these warriors, according to the priests, who saved not just Athens but all of Europe and Asia from conquest and slavery at the hands of a mighty empire that arose in those ancient days on an island far to the west. According to the Egyptian priests, there arose in those ancient days a mighty empire on an island in the Atlantic Ocean, beyond the strait known to the Greeks as the Pillars of Hercules, the narrow passage between Europe and Africa that marks the boundary between the familiar Mediterranean Sea and the vast, mysterious ocean beyond. This island was enormous, larger than Libya and Asia combined, a landmass of such extent that it seemed almost impossible to the Greeks, who were accustomed to thinking of islands as small pieces of land scattered through the sea. The island was called Atlantis, and it was the heart of a vast imperial power that ruled not only its own territories, but also parts of the great continent that lay beyond the ocean, as well as many islands in the surrounding sea. The Atlanteans had built a civilization of extraordinary sophistication and power. They had developed advanced technologies, constructed magnificent cities, and assembled powerful armies and navies. The kings of Atlantis were ambitious and aggressive, driven by a desire to extend their dominion over all the known world. They gathered their forces, marshalling vast fleets and armies, and launched a campaign of conquest against all of Europe and Asia. Their vast fleets, filled with warriors and siege equipment, sailed eastward through the Pillars of Hercules and into the Mediterranean. City after city fell before them. The islands of the Aegean were subdued and made tributary. The coastal cities of Asia Minor were forced to open their gates. Egypt, with all its ancient power and wisdom, fell under their dominion. The eastern Mediterranean became their lake. The Atlantean Empire seemed invincible, unstoppable, a force that would inevitably conquer the entire civilized world. But when the Atlantean forces reached the borders of Athenian territory, they met resistance. The armies of ancient Athens, led by their warrior philosophers, stood alone against this empire from beyond the world. The other Greek cities had already been conquered, or had submitted without a fight, but Athens refused to bow. The Athenians fought with courage and skill that astonished even their enemies. They employed superior tactics, using their knowledge of the local terrain and their disciplined formations to offset the numerical superiority of the Atlantean forces. They fought not for glory or plunder, but for freedom and justice, and this moral clarity gave them strength that their enemies could not match. In a series of desperate battles, they defeated the Atlantean forces and drove them back. They liberated all the lands that had been conquered, freeing the enslaved peoples and restoring their independence. The Atlantean Empire, which had seemed so mighty and invincible, was broken. Its armies were scattered, its fleets destroyed, its ambitions thwarted by the courage of a single city that refused to submit. But then, in the moment of Athens' greatest triumph, catastrophe struck. In a single day and night of violent earthquakes and floods, the entire island of Atlantis was swallowed by the sea. The great empire, with all its power and sophistication, vanished beneath the waves as if it had never existed. The Athenian army, still camped on the distant shores where they had fought their victorious campaigns, was swept away by the same cataclysm. Enormous tsunamis generated by the destruction of Atlantis rolled across the Mediterranean, devastating coastlines and drowning entire populations, and so both the victors and the vanquished disappeared from history, remembered only in the sacred records kept by the priests of Egypt. The catastrophe was so complete, so overwhelming, that it erased almost all memory of what had happened. The few survivors, scattered across the Mediterranean world, lacked the knowledge and resources to rebuild their civilizations. For generations, they lived in primitive conditions, struggling simply to survive, and the memory of the Great War and the lost empire faded into legend and eventually into forgetfulness. As Plato finishes reading this section, you watch the faces of his students. Some are captivated, leaning forward with wonder and excitement in their eyes, transported by the story to that distant age of heroes and catastrophes. Others look skeptical, their brows furrowed, uncertain whether this is history or allegory, whether they are supposed to believe this literally or interpret it symbolically. Plato himself gives no clear answer. He does not pause to explain whether he believes the story is true or whether he is using it as an illustration of philosophical points. He allows the story to stand on its own, a tale passed down through generations, a narrative that blends moral instruction with geographical mystery. In the days that follow, Plato reads more from a companion dialogue, one he calls Critias, named after the philosopher who tells the story. This second work, which he has not yet completed, provides far greater detail about the island itself, describing its geography, its cities, and its people with such precision and specificity that it almost seems as though Plato is recounting a place he has visited himself, a traveler's account rather than a philosopher's invention. Yet he insists, through his narrator, that all of this information comes from the ancient Egyptian records as told to Solon, and that Solon had written the story down, intending to compose an epic poem about it, but had never completed the work. You listen carefully, trying to form an image in your mind of this vanished world. The description is vivid and specific, almost like a geographer's report or an architect's plans. Plato speaks of the island's layout, the arrangement of its cities, the materials used in its construction, and the social organization of its people. He describes a civilization of immense sophistication and power, blessed by the gods but ultimately corrupted by pride and ambition. The level of detail is remarkable, almost excessive, and it raises a question that will haunt readers for the next 2,000 years. Why would Plato invent such elaborate specifics if the whole story was merely a fiction? And yet, if the story is true, why has no other source ever mentioned this great empire and its catastrophic destruction? Now imagine that you are no longer sitting in the academy in Athens, listening to an old philosopher read from his scrolls. Imagine instead that you are standing on the shore of the great ocean beyond the known world. The wind is strong and salt-heavy, carrying the smell of seaweed and brine. It whips your clothes and stings your eyes. The waves crash against black volcanic rocks, sending up great plumes of spray that catch the afternoon light and create momentary rainbows. The sound is overwhelming, a constant roar that makes it difficult to think, a reminder of the raw power of the sea. Behind you, far in the distance, visible on clear days as dim shapes on the horizon, are the Pillars of Hercules, the great limestone promontories that mark the boundary between the Mediterranean Sea and the vast expanse of the Atlantic. The Greeks call them the edge of the world, the limit of civilization, the point beyond which only madness and monsters await. Before you, somewhere out in that endless blue, somewhere beyond the reach of any ship that has ever sailed from the Mediterranean, lies the island that Plato described. You close your eyes and let the philosopher's words guide your vision. You see it rising from the sea, a mountainous island of astonishing size and beauty, its peaks snow-capped even in summer, its slopes green with forests and dotted with white buildings. The central mountain is sacred, the dwelling place of Poseidon, the god of the sea and earthquakes, the divine ancestor of the Atlantean royal line. At its base, extending toward the coast, is a great plain, perfectly rectangular, stretching as far as the eye can see. And at the heart of that plain, connected to the ocean by a great canal, is the most extraordinary city ever conceived by human hands, a city that defies everything you know about urban planning and architecture. The city of Atlantis is not built in the manner of other ancient cities, with irregular streets that follow the contours of the land, with neighborhoods that grow organically over generations. It is a perfect work of geometric design, a city of concentric circles that reflect the divine order of the cosmos, the mathematical harmonies that Plato believes underlie all of reality. At the very center is a hill, not large but perfectly formed, rising like a natural acropolis. On that hill stands a temple to Poseidon and a royal palace of surpassing magnificence. Surrounding this central hill are alternating rings of land and water, 3 rings of water and 2 rings of land, each separated from the others by perfect circular canals. These rings are not natural formations. They were carved from the earth by the god Poseidon himself, according to the legend, when he first fell in love with a mortal woman named Cleito, the mother of the first Atlantean kings. The story of Poseidon and Cleito is the origin myth of Atlantis, the founding narrative that explains how the island came to be inhabited and how the royal line was established. Cleito was, according to Plato, the daughter of one of the first human inhabitants of the island, a man who lived a simple life tending his flocks on the slopes of the central mountain. Poseidon, wandering across the ocean in his chariot drawn by seahorses, saw the island and was struck by its beauty. He came ashore to explore, and there he encountered Cleito, who was gathering flowers in a meadow near her father's simple dwelling. The god fell instantly in love with the mortal woman, captivated by her beauty and innocence. He approached her, and she, awed by his divine presence, accepted his suit. To protect her, and to create a fitting home for his bride, Poseidon shaped the land itself. He caused the central hill where Cleito lived to be surrounded by these alternating rings of water and land, 3 rings of water and 2 rings of land, each perfectly circular, forming a natural fortress that no ordinary man could penetrate. Within this protected space, hidden from the rest of the world, Poseidon and Cleito lived together, and she bore him 5 pairs of twin sons, 10 children in all, who would become the first kings of Atlantis. When the children were grown, Poseidon divided the island among them. To the eldest, named Atlas, he gave the central city and the surrounding plain, as well as sovereignty over his 9 brothers. Atlas became the first high king of Atlantis, and the island itself was named after him. The other 9 brothers were given territories as well, some on the island itself and others on distant islands and parts of the mainland beyond the ocean. Each brother ruled his territory as a king, But all were bound to obey Atlas and his descendants, and they gathered regularly to consult on matters of common concern and to renew their oaths of loyalty to one another. Over the generations, the descendants of Poseidon and Plato transformed these divine defenses into a city of unparalleled splendor. They built bridges across the rings of water, connecting the central hill to the outer districts. They lined the canals with stone quays where ships could moor. They erected magnificent buildings using 3 types of stone quarried from beneath the island itself, one white, one black and one red, creating walls and buildings that were striped with natural color, giving the city a distinctive and beautiful appearance even from a great distance at sea. The rings of land are wide enough to contain entire districts of the city, each with its own character and function. The outermost ring is home to the common people, the merchants, the craftsmen, the sailors, and the laborers who keep the great city functioning. Their houses are built of the colored stone, 2 or 3 stories tall, with flat roofs where families gather in the evening to enjoy the cool breeze from the sea. The streets are paved with smooth stone, carefully fitted together, sloping slightly to channel rainwater into drains that flow into the canals. At regular intervals, you pass fountains fed by natural springs that flow from deep beneath the island. These springs are both hot and cold, a gift from the volcanic forces that shaped this land long ago. The hot springs are especially prized, for the water is rich in minerals that are believed to have healing properties. The Atlanteans have built elaborate bathhouses around these springs, some public and some private, where citizens come to bathe, to socialize, to relax, and to seek relief from illness or injury. The bathhouses are architectural marvels, with vaulted ceilings, intricate mosaics on the floors depicting scenes from mythology, and pools of different temperatures where bathers can move from hot to cold and back again. The markets are alive with activity from dawn until dusk. Vendors sell fish caught in the surrounding ocean, displayed on beds of ice brought down from the mountains, their scales still gleaming with freshness. There is tuna and mackerel, sea bass and grouper, octopus and squid, shellfish of every description. Other stalls offer grain grown on the great plain beyond the city, wheat and barley in sacks and baskets, the kernels golden and plump. There are fruits and vegetables from the island's orchards and gardens, apples and pears, figs and grapes, olives and pomegranates, all arranged in attractive displays to tempt buyers. There are stalls selling cloth, linen and wool dyed in bright colors, purple and crimson and blue. There are stalls selling pottery, both the simple earthenware vessels used in every household, and the fine decorated ware that is exported to distant lands. There are metal workers selling tools and weapons, bronze knives and spearheads, copper pots and pans. The air is filled with the sounds of commerce, vendors calling out their wares, buyers haggling over prices, the constant hum of human activity. There is a sense of prosperity and abundance everywhere you look. The people are well fed, well clothed, and confident in the power and stability of their civilization. They dress simply but well, in tunics and robes of good quality fabric, and many wear jewelry, necklaces, and bracelets and earrings of gold and silver, testifying to their wealth. They speak a language that is not Greek, not Egyptian, not like any tongue known in the Mediterranean world. It is their own, unique to the island, shaped by thousands of years of isolation beyond the Pillars of Hercules. The language is melodious and complex, with many vowels and flowing consonants, and it is written in a script that bears no resemblance to any known writing system. A script of curves and spirals that seems to reflect the circular geometry of the city itself. As you move inward toward the next ring of water, you come to the first of the great canals. These waterways are wide, perhaps 300 feet from bank to bank, and deep enough to accommodate even the largest ships. The water is clear and clean, for the Atlanteans have strict laws against throwing refuse into the canals. The banks are lined with stone quays, and tied up at intervals are vessels of all kinds. There are merchant ships with broad hulls and single masts, their holds filled with cargo from distant lands, amphorae of wine and oil, bales of cloth, ingots of metal. There are fishing boats, smaller and nimbler, returning from their expeditions into the open ocean, and there are the sleek warships of the Atlantean navy, painted in the colors of the royal fleet, their bronze rams gleaming, their decks bristling with weapons. The canals are connected to the sea by a single great channel that cuts through all the rings, a waterway 50 stadia long, 300 feet wide, and 100 feet deep. This channel allows even the largest ships to sail from the ocean directly into the heart of the city, bringing tribute and trade goods from across the Atlantean Empire. You watch as a galley glides past, its oars moving in perfect rhythm, cutting through the water with barely a sound. The bronze-sheathed ram at its prow catches the sunlight, and you can see the carved figurehead, a representation of Poseidon himself, trident in hand, guarding the ship. Crossing the canal on one of the great stone bridges, you pass through a guarded gateway and enter the second ring of land. This ring is narrower than the first, but the buildings here are more impressive, larger, and more ornate. This is the district of the wealthy merchants and the lower nobility, the administrators and military officers who serve the royal family. Their homes are spacious, often 2 or 3 stories tall, built around central courtyards where fountains play and gardens flourish. The courtyards are planted with trees that provide shade and fruit, fig trees and pomegranates, and flower beds filled with roses and lilies. Some houses have rooftop terraces where families gather in the evening to watch the sun set over the ocean, to dine in the cool of the evening, and to gaze up at the stars. The streets here are cleaner, the stonework more precise, the overall impression one of greater refinement and attention to detail. At intervals, you see small shrines to Poseidon, simple altars of stone, where citizens leave offerings of flowers, wine, or incense. These shrines are tended by priests, men who have dedicated their lives to the service of the god, and each morning they perform rituals of purification and offering, ensuring that the god's favor continues to rest upon the city. The people of Atlantis revere the sea god above all others, for he is their divine ancestor, the source of their strength and prosperity. They believe that as long as they honor him, the sea will provide for them, the fish will be abundant, the storms will be mild, and their enemies will be unable to threaten them. They make sacrifices to him before any important undertaking, seeking his blessing on voyages, on battles, on the construction of new buildings. The second canal is even busier than the first, for it serves as the primary military harbor of the city. Here, the shipyards of Atlantis construct the vast fleets that patrol the empire's far-flung territories and project Atlantean power across the ocean. You see dozens of warships moored along the stone quays, their masts towering overhead like a forest of bare trees, their decks swarming with sailors making repairs, replacing worn rigging and loading supplies for upcoming voyages. The smell of tar and sawdust mingles with the salt air. In great covered sheds along the canal's edge, sheds with roofs supported by massive wooden beams, shipwrights work on new vessels. The air rings with the sound of hammers on bronze nails, the rasp of saws cutting through seasoned timber, the voices of foremen shouting orders to their crews. The process of shipbuilding is meticulous and time-consuming. First, the keel is laid, a massive timber that forms the backbone of the ship. Then the ribs are attached, curving upward from the keel to define the shape of the hull. Planks are fitted to the ribs, each one carefully shaped to follow the curve of the hull, and they are fastened with bronze nails driven through pre-drilled holes. The seams between the planks are caulked with oakum, strands of old rope soaked in tar, hammered into the gaps to make them watertight. The hull is then coated with pitch, a thick black substance that protects the wood from rot and from the shipworms that bore into untreated timber. The Atlantean Navy is the most powerful maritime force in the known world, perhaps the most powerful that has ever existed. Their ships are faster and more maneuverable than any others, benefiting from centuries of accumulated knowledge about hull design, rigging, and navigation. Their sailors are trained from childhood to read the winds and currents, to navigate by the stars, to anticipate changes in the weather by observing the behavior of birds and the color of the sky. They can sail far from land without fear, knowing that their skills and their ships will bring them safely home. It is this navy that has allowed the kings of Atlantis to extend their power across the ocean, conquering islands and coastal lands, establishing colonies and trading posts throughout the Great Sea beyond the Pillars of Hercules. The Navy is not just a military force but also the backbone of Atlantean commerce, for it is their ships that carry trade goods to distant markets and bring back the wealth that has made the city so prosperous. Crossing the second canal, you pass through another fortified gate, this one even more heavily guarded than the first. The guards are tall men in bronze armor, carrying long spears and large shields emblazoned with the symbol of Atlantis, a trident enclosed in a circle. They examine you carefully, checking to ensure that you have permission to enter the inner ring, for this is a restricted area, open only to those of the highest rank. You are allowed to pass, and you enter the innermost ring of land, the domain of the royal family and the highest nobility. The buildings here are not merely houses but palaces, each one a testament to the wealth and power of the Atlantean elite. The walls are covered with precious metals. Plato tells us that the Atlanteans possessed a metal called orichalcum, a substance that gleamed with a reddish-golden light, second in value only to gold itself. This mysterious metal, which existed nowhere else in the ancient world, was mined from the earth of Atlantis in great quantities, and it was used to sheath the walls of the most important buildings, so that they shone in the sun like fire, visible from miles away. Modern scholars have speculated endlessly about what orichalcum might have been. Some have suggested that it was a natural alloy of gold and copper, others that it was brass or bronze, still others that it was some exotic mineral that has since been lost. But in Plato's account, orichalcum is clearly something extraordinary, a material that marked Atlantis as a place apart, a land blessed with resources that no other civilization could match. The inner ring is encircled by a wall covered entirely in bronze, polished to a mirror finish, so that it reflects the sky and sea, creating the illusion that the wall is made of water and light. As you approach the final canal, the innermost ring of water that surrounds the sacred hill itself, you see that the wall on the far side is coated in tin that flashes white in the sunlight, painful to look at directly. And beyond that, at the very center of the city, on the sacred hill where Poseidon first brought Plato, stands a wall covered in orichalcum, gleaming red and gold, visible from every part of the city, and from far out at sea, a beacon that announces to all who approach that they are entering the presence of divine power. You cross the final bridge and stand at the foot of the sacred hill. Before you rises the most magnificent building on the island, the Temple of Poseidon. It is enormous, a stadium in length, 3 plethra wide, and proportioned in height to match its vast footprint. The scale is overwhelming, dwarfing even the largest temples in the Mediterranean world. The entire exterior is covered in silver, hammered into thin sheets and fastened to the stone walls with silver nails. The silver has been polished so that it gleams like moonlight, and it is decorated with scenes from mythology, reliefs showing Poseidon rising from the sea, Poseidon battling the Titans, Poseidon blessing the founding of Atlantis. The roof is plated with gold, not gilt but solid gold, and it weighs countless tons, a display of wealth so extravagant that it seems almost obscene. You approach the entrance, walking up a broad staircase of white marble, each step perfectly level, so smooth that you can see your reflection in the polished stone. The doors of the temple are massive, made of bronze and decorated with more scenes from the life of Poseidon. They stand open, and you enter into a vast interior space. The ceiling is made of ivory, intricately carved and inlaid with gold, silver, and orichalcum, depicting the constellations of the night sky, each star picked out in a different precious metal. The walls are decorated with more reliefs, these showing the mythical history of the island, the arrival of Poseidon, his union with Plato, the birth of their 10 sons, the division of the island among them, the expansion of Atlantean power across the ocean. The floor is made of marble in alternating squares of black and white, creating a checkerboard pattern that adds to the sense of geometric perfection. The air inside is cool and slightly damp, and it smells of incense, myrrh, and frankincense, burning on altars throughout the temple. At the center of the temple stands a colossal statue of Poseidon himself, so tall that his head nearly touches the ceiling 100 feet above. The god is shown standing in a golden chariot, his right hand grasping a massive trident, his left hand holding the reins that control 6 winged horses, each horse carved from ivory and decorated with gold. Surrounding the chariot are 100 Nereids, the sea nymphs who are Poseidon's attendants, each riding on a dolphin carved from bronze and silver. The statue is made of gold and ivory, in the technique known as chryselephantine, the same technique used for the statue of Zeus at Olympia and the statue of Athena in the Parthenon. The gold is used for the god's clothing, his chariot, and his horses, while the ivory is used for his flesh, polished to a smooth, creamy texture that mimics human skin. The statue is so large and so richly decorated that visitors from distant lands stand in silent awe before it, unable to speak, overwhelmed by the power and wealth it represents. Around the temple, in a sacred grove enclosed by golden walls, stand statues of the first 10 kings of Atlantis, the sons of Poseidon and Plato. Each king is depicted as larger than life, cast in bronze or carved from marble, holding the symbols of their office, scepters and wreaths and shields. These 10 brothers were the founders of the Atlantean state, and from them are descended all the royal dynasties that have ruled the island for countless generations. The Atlanteans believe that their kings are not merely mortal men, but demigods, possessing a portion of divine blood that makes them stronger, wiser, longer-lived, and more capable than ordinary humans. This belief in the divine nature of kingship is central to the Atlantean worldview and political system. It justifies the absolute power of the monarchy and the hierarchical structure of their society. The kings rule by divine right, and to disobey them is to disobey Poseidon himself, to court the wrath of the god who can shake the earth and send tsunamis to devastate the coasts. Adjacent to the temple is the royal palace, a sprawling complex of halls, courtyards, and gardens that serves as the administrative center of the empire. From here, the kings of Atlantis govern their vast territories, receive ambassadors from subject nations, and plan their military campaigns. The palace is built on the same grand scale as the temple, with walls of colored stone, white and black and red, arranged in decorative patterns. The floors are made of precious marble, quarried from distant lands and shipped to Atlantis at enormous expense. The ceilings are painted with scenes of conquest and triumph, showing Atlantean armies defeating their enemies, Atlantean fleets sailing victorious into foreign harbors, subject peoples bringing tribute to the kings. The throne room is especially impressive, a long hall with columns carved to resemble the trunks of palm trees, their capitals shaped like fronds spreading outward to support the ceiling. The walls are lined with benches where nobles and officials sit during royal audiences, arranged in careful order according to their rank. At the far end of the hall, on a raised platform approached by 7 steps, sits the throne itself. It is made of gold and ivory, inlaid with gemstones brought from every corner of the empire, rubies and sapphires, emeralds and diamonds. The back of the throne is carved with an image of Poseidon, so that when the king sits, he seems to be seated within the protective embrace of the god. When the king holds court, the room is filled with nobles and officials, all standing in their designated places, dressed in robes of fine linen dyed in purple and crimson, the colors of royalty. Petitioners approach the throne to seek justice, to present grievances, to request favors. The king listens to each case, consults with his advisors, and renders judgment. His word is law, absolute and final, for he is the representative of Poseidon on earth, and his authority is divine. You step out of the throne room and into the gardens of the royal palace, and here the atmosphere changes dramatically. The gardens are a place of peace and beauty, far removed from the formality and hierarchy of the palace interiors. They are laid out in the traditional style, with winding paths that lead past fountains and pools, through groves of flowering trees and beds of exotic plants. The Atlanteans, with their vast maritime empire, have access to plants from every climate and every land. There are date palms from the desert regions of Africa, their fronds rustling in the breeze. There are olive trees from the Mediterranean, their leaves silver green, their gnarled trunks testifying to great age. There are strange flowering plants from the tropical islands of the outer ocean, plants with huge leaves and brilliant blossoms in shades of red and orange that seem almost unnaturally vivid. The air is perfumed with the scent of these blossoms, a heavy sweetness that is almost intoxicating. Peacocks wander the paths, their iridescent feathers catching the light, their harsh cries breaking the silence. In the center of the garden is a large pool fed by one of the sacred springs, its water crystal clear and cool even in the heat of midday. The pool is surrounded by marble benches where members of the royal family can sit and enjoy the tranquility of the garden. This is a place where they can retreat from the burdens of rule, where they can relax and enjoy the pleasures that their wealth and power have provided. Children play here, the sons and daughters of the royal line, watched over by attentive nurses. They chase each other through the paths, their laughter echoing off the palace walls, oblivious to the weight of destiny that rests upon their shoulders. But even in this paradise, even in this haven of beauty and peace, there is a sense of unease, a subtle wrongness that you cannot quite identify. Perhaps it is the excessive display of wealth, the oppressive splendor of all this gold and silver and precious stone. Perhaps it is the hierarchical rigidity of the society, the vast gulf between the nobility in their palaces and the common people in the outer rings. Perhaps it is something deeper, a moral corruption that has infected the very heart of the civilization. for the kings of Atlantis, despite their divine ancestry, are still mortal. They are subject to the same temptations and weaknesses as any other men. They can be corrupted by power, seduced by luxury, driven by ambition to acts of aggression and injustice. And as the generations pass, as the divine blood becomes diluted through intermarriage with mortals, the mortal nature begins to predominate. The kings and nobles of Atlantis are slowly forgetting their divine heritage, losing the virtue and wisdom that once characterized their rule. They are becoming greedy, ambitious, cruel, concerned only with their own power and pleasure, forgetting the responsibilities that come with their privileged position. This moral decline, which is happening gradually over generations, is the true tragedy of Atlantis, the fatal flaw that will eventually bring about its destruction. Now let us step back from the city itself and consider the broader landscape of the island, for Atlantis is not merely a single city, but an entire realm, a large island with diverse geography and abundant natural resources. Beyond the circular city, extending toward the southern coast, lies a vast plain, stretching as far as the eye can see. This plain is, according to Plato's description, perfectly rectangular in shape, 3,000 stadia long and 2,000 stadia wide, an area of approximately 12,000 square miles, roughly the size of the island of Sicily or the state of Massachusetts. It is surrounded on three sides by mountains that shield it from the cold northern winds and channel rainfall onto the plain itself. The mountains are not excessively high, but they are steep and rugged, their peaks often shrouded in clouds, their slopes covered in dense forests of oak and pine. The plain itself is extraordinarily fertile, the soil rich and dark, volcanic in origin, capable of producing astonishing yields of every kind of crop. The Atlanteans have transformed this natural abundance into a marvel of agricultural engineering. The entire plain is crisscrossed by an elaborate system of canals and irrigation ditches, a vast network that allows them to control the distribution of water with great precision, ensuring that every field receives exactly the amount of moisture it needs. The main canal runs along the entire perimeter of the plain, forming a perfect rectangle that matches the shape of the land itself. This perimeter canal is enormous, 100 feet deep and a stadium in width, large enough to accommodate merchant ships traveling between the city and the agricultural districts. From this great perimeter canal, smaller channels branch off at regular intervals, running perpendicular to the main canal, dividing the plain into a grid of fields and orchards. These smaller channels are used both for irrigation and for transportation. Farmers can load their produce onto small boats and float them down the canals to collection points where larger vessels wait to carry the goods to the city, avoiding the need for slow and expensive overland transport. The soil of the plain produces abundant crops of wheat and barley, the staple grains that form the foundation of the Atlantean diet. The fields stretch to the horizon, a vast expanse of golden stalks waving in the wind, ready for harvest. The yields are so great that the Atlanteans can feed their entire population with a surplus left over for export to other lands. They also cultivate olive trees for oil, planting them in long rows on the drier slopes at the edge of the plain. The olive harvest is a time of celebration, when entire families work together to pick the fruit and press it in stone mills, extracting the golden oil that is used for cooking, for lighting lamps, for making soap, and for ritual anointing. They grow grapevines for wine, training the vines on wooden stakes or allowing them to climb trees, and the wine they produce is of exceptional quality, rich and full-bodied, prized in markets throughout the Mediterranean. They cultivate orchards of apples, pears and figs, the trees planted in neat rows, carefully pruned and tended to maximize fruit production. In the warmer regions near the coast, they grow date palms and citrus trees, fruits that require more heat and that fetch high prices in northern markets where such things are exotic luxuries. The plain is also home to vast herds of cattle, sheep and horses. The cattle are raised primarily for their meat and hides, though some cows are kept for milk and cheese production. The sheep are raised for wool, which is sheared each spring and sent to mills where it is cleaned, carded, spun into yarn, and woven into cloth. The horses are especially important, for the Atlantean military depends on cavalry. The horses of Atlantis are famous throughout the ancient world, bred for generations to be swift, strong, and brave in battle. They are tall animals with sleek coats and intelligent eyes, and they are trained from a young age to respond to the commands of their riders, to charge without hesitation, to stand firm in the chaos of battle. The wealth of the plain is one of the chief sources of Atlantean power. While other civilizations struggle with famine and scarcity, having to import grain from distant lands at great expense, Atlantis produces food in such abundance that it can sustain a large population and support a professional military and administrative class. The surplus grain and other agricultural products are exported to other lands, bringing in additional wealth that further enriches the already prosperous island. The organization of agriculture on the plain is highly structured and efficient. The land is divided into large estates, each controlled by a noble family. These families are responsible for managing the cultivation of their estates, for providing seed and tools to the farmers who work the land, for maintaining the canals and irrigation systems, for ensuring that the harvest is brought in on time and in good condition. In return for their labor, the farmers receive a portion of the crop and the protection of their noble patrons. It is a system that has worked well for generations, producing stability and prosperity, though it also creates a rigid social hierarchy in which the farmers have little freedom and few opportunities to improve their status. The mountains that border the plain are rich in natural resources as well. The Atlanteans mine copper, tin, and the mysterious orichalcum from deep shafts sunk into the mountainsides. Mining is dangerous work, carried out by teams of skilled workers who descend into the earth on rope ladders, carrying oil lamps to light their way through the dark tunnels. They chip away at the rock face with bronze picks, extracting ore that is then carried to the surface in baskets. The ore is smelted in furnaces heated by charcoal, and the molten metal is poured into molds to create ingots that can be easily transported and traded. Copper and tin are combined to create bronze, the primary metal used for tools and weapons in the ancient world. Orichalcum, whatever its true nature, is reserved for decorative purposes, for sheathing the walls of important buildings, for making jewelry and ceremonial objects that demonstrate the wealth and power of their owners. The mountains are also covered in dense forests, providing an endless supply of timber for shipbuilding and construction. Great logging camps operate in the high valleys, where teams of workers fell trees, trim off the branches, and drag the trunks to the nearest stream. The logs are floated down the swift mountain streams to sawmills near the coast, where they are cut into planks and beams and stored in vast timber yards until they are needed. The forests are home to abundant wildlife. Hunters venture into the mountains in pursuit of deer, wild boar, and mountain goats. The meat from these animals supplements the diet of the Atlanteans, and the hides are tanned and made into leather for shoes, belts, and armor. There are also, according to Plato, elephants on Atlantis, a detail that has fascinated and puzzled readers for centuries. These elephants, he tells us, are numerous and thrive in the island's temperate climate, finding plenty of food in the forests and meadows. Whether they are native to the island or were imported from some distant land is never explained. The presence of elephants on an island in the Atlantic Ocean is, to say the least, implausible from a zoological and geographical standpoint. Modern elephants are found only in Africa and Asia, and there is no evidence that they ever existed in the Atlantic region. Some scholars have suggested that Plato's mention of elephants is symbolic, representing the exotic and extraordinary nature of Atlantis, a land where impossible things are possible. Others have taken it as further evidence that the story is fictional, a fantasy rather than a historical account. Still others have used the elephant detail to argue that Atlantis must have been located not in the Atlantic but in Africa or Asia, where elephants did actually exist. Whatever the truth, the image of elephants roaming the forests of Atlantis adds to the sense of wonder and strangeness that surrounds the legend. The coastline of Atlantis is rugged and varied, offering many different landscapes and ecosystems. In some places, steep cliffs drop directly into the ocean, white stone faces streaked with black volcanic rock, battered by the endless waves that crash against them with tremendous force. Seabirds nest on these cliffs, thousands of them, gulls and cormorants and petrels, their calls echoing off the stone, their white droppings covering the rocks. In other places, there are wide sandy beaches and sheltered coves where fishing villages cluster around small harbors. The Atlanteans are a seafaring people, and every coastal community contributes to the maritime strength of the empire. Fishermen set out each morning in small boats, rowing or sailing beyond the surf line to cast their nets and lines. They bring in abundant catches of tuna, mackerel, sea bass, grouper, and octopus, fish that are sold fresh in the markets of the city or preserved by salting and drying for storage and transport. Divers descend to the seabed to harvest sponges which are used for bathing and cleaning, and to gather oysters, some of which contain valuable pearls. The tidal pools that form along the rocky sections of coast are rich with shellfish, mussels and clams and sea urchins, which are collected at low tide and sold in the markets or eaten fresh by the collectors themselves. The relationship between the Atlanteans and the sea is intimate and profound, going far beyond mere economic dependence. The sea is their highway, connecting them to distant lands and peoples. It is their pantry, providing an endless supply of food. It is their protection, a vast moat that shields them from invasion by land powers. And it is their spiritual center, the domain of Poseidon, the god who is their divine ancestor and protector. They worship Poseidon not merely as a distant ancestor but as an active presence in their daily lives. A god who watches over them, who controls the winds and waves, who can bless them with prosperity or punish them with destruction. They make offerings to him before every voyage, pouring wine into the waves and praying for calm seas and favorable winds. They build temples to him along the coast, simple structures where sailors can stop to make prayers and offerings before setting out on dangerous journeys. They believe that the god watches over them, protecting them from storms and shipwrecks, guiding their admirals to victory in naval battles, ensuring that their fishing nets are always full. This faith in divine protection has made them bold and confident sailors willing to venture far beyond the sight of land in search of new territories to conquer and new peoples to subjugate, secure in the knowledge that Poseidon will bring them safely home. As the years pass and the generations succeed one another, the Atlantean Empire grows ever larger and more powerful. The kings send out expeditions to explore the ocean beyond their island, and they discover many other lands. To the west, they find a great continent, a vast landmass with endless forests and mighty rivers, inhabited by tribal peoples who have not yet developed the arts of writing or stone architecture, who live in simple huts and subsist by hunting, fishing, and primitive agriculture. The Atlanteans establish colonies along the coast of this continent, trading posts where they exchange metal tools and weapons for furs, timber, and exotic feathers. Some of these colonies grow into cities in their own right, governed by Atlantean viceroys but populated by a mixture of colonists from the island and natives from the interior who have been drawn to the cities by the opportunities they offer. To the south and east, Atlantean ships sail through the Pillars of Hercules and into the Mediterranean. Here they encounter the civilizations of the ancient world, the Egyptians with their massive pyramids and sophisticated bureaucracy, the Greeks with their beautiful cities and philosophical traditions, the peoples of Asia Minor and the Levant with their own rich cultures and long histories. At first, the relationship is one of trade and mutual benefit. Atlantean merchants bring precious metals, rare timbers and exotic goods from the Western Ocean, exchanging them for olive oil, wine, fine textiles and manufactured goods. But as Atlantean power grows and their ambitions expand, the relationship becomes more predatory and exploitative. The kings of Atlantis begin to see the Mediterranean lands not as trading partners, but as territories ripe for conquest. They send envoys to the cities of Greece and Asia, demanding tribute and submission, insisting that these cities acknowledge Atlantean overlordship and send regular payments of gold, silver, grain, and slaves. When these demands are refused, as they inevitably are, the kings dispatch their fleets and armies to enforce their will by force. One by one, the coastal cities fall under Atlantean domination. The islands of the Aegean are subdued and made tributary, their populations forced to provide soldiers and rowers for Atlantean military campaigns. The coastal cities of Asia Minor are compelled to open their gates to Atlantean garrisons. Even the great power of Egypt is forced to acknowledge Atlantean supremacy, allowing Atlantean merchants to trade freely in the ports of the Nile Delta and providing hostages to ensure the pharaoh's continued loyalty and cooperation. The Atlantean Empire is now a true superpower, controlling vast territories on both sides of the Pillars of Hercules, with a navy that rules the waves and an army that has never been defeated in open battle. But as the empire expands and as the wealth and power of Atlantis reach their zenith, the character of its people begins to change in subtle but profound ways. In the early generations, when the blood of Poseidon was still strong in the royal line, the kings of Atlantis ruled with wisdom and justice. They lived simply, despite their enormous wealth, and they governed according to sacred laws that had been established by their divine ancestor. These laws were inscribed on a pillar of orichalcum that stood in the temple of Poseidon, and they set out the rights and responsibilities of kings, the proper conduct of warfare, the fair treatment of subjects, and the proper worship of the gods. The laws were considered sacred and inviolable. and every king swore at his coronation to uphold them. Every 5 or 6 years, the 10 kings of the island, the descendants of the original 10 brothers, would gather in the temple of Poseidon to renew their oaths and settle disputes according to these ancient statutes. The ceremony was solemn and sacred, designed to remind the kings of their divine heritage and their obligations to rule justly. It began with a ritual hunt. The 10 kings, armed only with wooden staves and ropes, no metal weapons allowed, would pursue a bull through the sacred grove surrounding the temple. The bull was allowed to roam free within the grove, and the kings had to work together to capture it, demonstrating their ability to cooperate and their physical prowess. Once they had captured the bull, they would lead it to the Pillar of Hercules and sacrifice it there, allowing its blood to flow over the inscribed laws. They would then mix wine with a drop of the bull's blood in a golden bowl, and each king would drink from the bowl, swearing to uphold the laws of Poseidon and to rule with justice and humility. After taking this oath, the kings would dress in robes of deep blue, the color of the sea, and they would sit in judgment through the night, deliberating on matters of state, settling disputes between the 10 kingdoms, and rendering verdicts on any king who had violated the sacred laws. Their judgments were recorded on golden tablets, and dedicated to the god as a memorial of their justice and their faithfulness to their divine ancestor. At dawn, they would remove their blue robes, dress again in their royal garments, and return to their respective territories, bound to one another and to the laws by their renewed oaths. This ritual, and the laws it embodied, kept the Atlantean state virtuous and strong for many generations. The kings did not compete with one another for power, but cooperated for the good of the whole island. They did not oppress their subjects, but ruled with fairness and restraint, understanding that their legitimacy depended on the consent of the governed and on their faithful adherence to divine law. They honored the gods with appropriate sacrifices and ceremonies, keeping the sacred traditions that had been passed down from the beginning. They were, in short, the ideal rulers that Plato describes in his Republic, philosopher kings who combined wisdom, courage, moderation, and justice. But as the generations passed and the divine blood became diluted through intermarriage with ordinary mortals, the character of the kings began to change. The mortal nature, the human appetite for wealth and power and pleasure, began to predominate over the divine. The kings started to see their office not as a sacred trust, but as a source of personal glory and enrichment. They competed with one another in displays of wealth, building ever more elaborate palaces, commissioning ever larger statues, throwing ever more extravagant banquets. They began to neglect the sacred ceremonies or to perform them as mere formalities, without genuine reverence or devotion. They started to interpret the laws in ways that served their own interests rather than the common good. They became arrogant and proud, convinced of their own superiority, contemptuous of those beneath them in the social hierarchy. The common people, seeing the example set by their rulers, also became more greedy and ambitious, more concerned with their own advancement than with the welfare of the community. The merchants sought to maximize their profits without regard for fairness or honesty, adulterating their goods, cheating their customers, exploiting their workers. The military commanders pursued conquest for the sake of personal glory rather than for the defense of the realm, seeking to win fame and plunder through aggressive wars that benefited only themselves and their followers. The priests, who should have maintained the purity of religious practice, became worldly and corrupt, more interested in accumulating wealth and political influence than in serving the gods with sincerity and devotion. They sold sacred offices to the highest bidder, accepting bribes to grant favorable oracles, using their authority to advance their own interests. The whole society, from the highest to the lowest, began to lose the virtue that had made it great. To those who could see clearly, who still remembered the old ways and the sacred laws, this moral decline was obvious and alarming. There were still a few wise men on Atlantis, philosophers and priests who understood that the civilization was losing its moral foundation, that it was heading toward disaster. They spoke out, warning their fellow citizens that the gods would not tolerate this corruption forever, that divine punishment would eventually fall upon those who had forgotten their duties and abandoned the laws of Poseidon. But their warnings were ignored or dismissed as the ravings of pessimists and malcontents. To the majority, blinded by success and intoxicated by power, it seemed that Atlantis was entering a golden age, that the empire had never been larger or wealthier or more secure. The city had never been more splendid, with its oracle-covered walls gleaming in the sun. The kings commanded fleets and armies of unprecedented size. The people enjoyed a standard of living that was the envy of the entire world. How could this be anything but a sign of divine favor? How could there be any cause for concern when everything was going so well? But the gods, and especially Zeus, the king of the gods and the overseer of the moral order, saw what was happening. Zeus perceived that an honorable race was falling into corruption, that a people descended from Poseidon himself were forgetting their divine heritage and behaving like common mortals, driven only by greed and ambition and lust for power. He saw that the Atlanteans had become unjust and aggressive, seeking to conquer and enslave other peoples not out of necessity or self-defense, but out of sheer rapacity and pride. He saw that they had violated the sacred laws, that they had forgotten the duties and responsibilities that came with their power and privilege. He resolved to punish them, to bring them back to virtue through suffering if that were possible, or if that proved impossible, to destroy them utterly as an example to all future generations, a warning that even the mightiest civilization can fall if it abandons justice and turns away from the gods. According to Plato, Zeus called together all the gods in his celestial palace, a magnificent structure located at the center of the cosmos, from which he could see everything that happened in the world below. He summoned the gods to council, and when they had all assembled, he addressed them, explaining what he had seen and what he intended to do about the corruption of the Atlanteans. But here, frustratingly and mysteriously, Plato's account breaks off. The dialogue called Critias is unfinished, ending in mid-sentence just as Zeus is about to pronounce judgment on Atlantis. We never hear what Zeus said in that divine council. We never learn what form the punishment took, or whether the gods debated among themselves about the fate of the Atlanteans. All we know, from the earlier dialogue Timaeus, is the outcome of Zeus's judgment. In a single day and night, the island of Atlantis was shaken by violent earthquakes and overwhelmed by floods, and it sank beneath the sea, vanishing completely, leaving behind only a stretch of impassable shoals that made the Western Ocean unnavigable for generations afterward. The reason Plato never finished the Critias is unknown. Perhaps he intended to complete it, but died before he could do so. Perhaps he decided that the story had served its philosophical purpose and that the details of the destruction were less important than the moral lesson. Perhaps he found that he had painted himself into a corner, that he could not satisfactorily resolve the narrative without undermining the points he was trying to make. Whatever the reason, the unfinished ending has added to the mystery and fascination of the Atlantis story, leaving readers to imagine for themselves the final hours of the doomed civilization. Imagine that final day, the last day in the history of Atlantis. The sun rises over the circular city, just as it has done for thousands upon thousands of mornings before. The sky is clear and blue, unmarked by any clouds. The air is warm and still. The fishermen set out from the harbor in their small boats, heading for the fishing grounds beyond the visible horizon. The merchants open their shops, arranging their wares, calling out to passers-by. The farmers in the Great Plain are already at work, tending their fields, checking the irrigation canals. The soldiers drill in their barracks, practicing formations and weapon skills. The priests perform the morning rituals in the temple of Poseidon, offering incense and prayers. Everything seems normal, routine, just another day in the long and prosperous history of Atlantis. There is no warning, no sign that this day will be different from any other, no indication that this is the last sunrise the Atlanteans will ever see. But then toward midday, as the sun climbs toward its zenith and the heat of the day begins to build, the earth begins to tremble. At first it is just a faint vibration, barely noticeable, a subtle sense that something is wrong. People pause in their work and glance at one another, uncertain, wondering if they imagined it. Then the shaking intensifies. It comes in waves, each wave stronger than the last. Buildings begin to sway, their stone walls creaking and groaning. Roof tiles slide off and shatter on the street below. Pottery falls from shelves and breaks. People run from their houses, seeking open ground, crying out in fear and confusion. In the temple of Poseidon, the great golden statue rocks on its base, and priests cry out in alarm, unsure whether this is a manifestation of the god's anger or merely a natural phenomenon that will pass. The shaking continues, growing stronger and stronger with each passing moment. The ground itself seems to be rolling like the sea in a storm, making it difficult to stand. Walls crack and collapse, sending up clouds of dust. The beautiful stone bridges that span the circular canals begin to crumble, their arches buckling, their keystones falling, their stones tumbling into the water with great splashes. The canals themselves begin to slosh violently, water surging back and forth, flooding over the banks and into the streets, sweeping away market stalls and small buildings. Out in the harbor, the warships are thrown against one another, their masts snapping like twigs, their hulls splintering, their crews jumping overboard to save themselves. Sailors struggle to cut anchor lines and row away from the docks before their vessels are dashed to pieces against the stone quays. On the Great Plain, farmers watch in horror as the ground splits open in long, jagged cracks, swallowing irrigation ditches and fences, toppling trees, opening up yawning chasms that seem to lead down into the earth's core. Cattle and sheep panic, stampeding in all directions, trampling anyone who gets in their way. The earth is groaning, emitting a deep sound like the voice of some immense subterranean beast, a sound that seems to come from the very center of the world. People scream prayers to Poseidon, begging the god to stop the earthquake, promising to make lavish sacrifices, to build new temples, to reform their ways. But the shaking does not stop. It grows more violent, more destructive, more terrifying. And then suddenly, those who are near the coast see something that fills them with absolute terror. The sea is receding, pulling back from the shore, exposing the seabed for hundreds of yards. Fish flop helplessly on the wet sand. Seaweed lies in tangled heaps. The hulls of wrecked ships that sank long ago are suddenly visible. For a moment, people stare in confusion, unable to understand what they are seeing. Some of the more foolish or greedy rush out onto the exposed seabed, thinking to gather fish or salvage treasure from the wrecks. But those who have knowledge of the sea, the old sailors and fishermen who have spent their lives on the water, understand immediately what is happening. They scream warnings to anyone who will listen. They urge people to flee inland, to seek high ground, to get as far from the coast as possible. For they know that when the sea recedes like this, it will return, and when it returns, it will come as a wall of water taller than any building, moving faster than any horse can run. The wave, when it strikes, is more terrible than anyone could have imagined. Those who see it approaching from the mountains describe it as a wall of dark green water, its face seething with foam, its crest curling over, stretching from one end of the horizon to the other. It makes a sound like continuous thunder, a roar that grows louder and louder until it drowns out even the screams of the terrified people. The wave sweeps across the coastal plain, tearing up trees and fields, obliterating entire villages in an instant, carrying ships and debris inland like toys. It crashes through the outer ring of the circular city, smashing through the bronze walls as if they were made of parchment, flooding the streets, filling the houses, carrying away everything not solidly anchored. People try to flee toward the center of the city, toward higher ground, but the water moves faster than they can run. They are swept away, tossed like leaves in a torrent, drowned or crushed against buildings. Ships that had been safely moored in the harbors are picked up and carried inland, crashing through buildings, adding to the destruction and chaos. The screams of the dying are lost in the roar of the water and the grinding crash of collapsing stone. Within minutes, the entire outer city is underwater. The beautiful geometric design, the alternating rings of land and water, all obliterated, transformed into a churning maelstrom of debris and foam. The wave surges through the circular canals, tearing apart the bridges, flooding the inner rings. Some people manage to climb to the roofs of taller buildings, or to the tops of the walls, clinging desperately to whatever handholds they can find. They watch in horror as their world dissolves around them, as the city that has stood for thousands of years is destroyed in a matter of minutes. The wave reaches the central hill, the sacred hill where the temple and palace stand. For a moment it seems as if the hill might be high enough to escape the worst of the flooding. The wave breaks against the orichalcum-covered walls, sending up towering plumes of spray, but the walls hold. Hundreds of survivors, perhaps thousands, have taken refuge on the hill, crowding into the temple, filling the courtyards of the palace, huddling together in terror. Some pray to Poseidon, begging him to spare them, promising to renew their devotion to the sacred laws. Others curse the gods, screaming that this punishment is unjust, that no crime deserves such a terrible fate. Still others are simply numb with shock, unable to process what is happening, staring with blank eyes at the destruction around them. But the earthquake has not stopped. The ground continues to shake, And now the tremors are even more violent than before. The orichalcum-covered walls begin to crack and buckle. Sections of wall collapse, tumbling down the slope of the hill. The great temple of Poseidon sways alarmingly, its silver-plated walls buckling, its golden roof beginning to come apart. The colossal statue of the god topples, crashing through the floor of the temple and tumbling down the hillside in a thunder of breaking metal and stone. The palace is collapsing, its painted ceilings falling in, its marble columns cracking and crumbling. People trapped inside scream as they are buried under tons of rubble. And then, with a final convulsive shudder that can be felt across the entire island, the ground beneath the central hill itself begins to fracture and sink. It is not a slow, gradual subsidence but a catastrophic collapse, as though the earth beneath Atlantis has simply given way, as though some enormous cavity has opened up deep below and the entire island is falling into it. The ocean rushes in from all sides, pouring into the void, creating whirlpools and currents of unimaginable violence. The mountains crack and tumble, their peaks sliding into the sea, their forests burning from fires started by the earthquake. The Great Plain, with its perfect grid of canals and its abundant fields, is swallowed up, disappearing beneath the churning water. The circular city, that marvel of engineering and architecture, sinks down into darkness, its orichalcum walls and its golden roofs vanishing beneath the waves. The last survivors, those who had clung to the highest points, have only moments to realize what is happening before the water closes over their heads. Some are pulled down by the currents, their lungs filling with seawater, drowning in the darkness. Others are crushed by falling debris, by the stones and timbers of collapsing buildings. A very few perhaps manage to cling to floating wreckage, to keep their heads above water long enough to hope for rescue. But there is no rescue. The destruction is complete, total, overwhelming. Within the space of a single day and night, the most powerful empire in the world has ceased to exist, erased from the surface of the earth as though it had never been. The waves generated by the sinking of Atlantis roll outward across the ocean, reaching distant coasts, devastating shorelines, drowning coastal populations who have no idea what has happened. In the Mediterranean, the tsunami strikes the coasts of Greece and Egypt, flooding cities and harbors, destroying ships and docks, killing thousands. The Athenian army, camped on some distant shore, is swept away. The carefully trained warriors, the philosopher soldiers who had defeated the Atlantean invasion, all perish, drowned by the same catastrophe that destroyed their enemies. And so both the victors and the vanquished disappear from history, leaving behind only scattered ruins and confused memories that will eventually fade into legend. In the days and weeks that follow, the survivors of the catastrophe, scattered across the Mediterranean world, struggle to make sense of what has happened. Some interpret it as divine punishment, the wrath of Zeus or Poseidon falling upon a civilization that had become corrupt and unjust. Others see it as a natural disaster, a terrible but ultimately meaningless event, the result of geological forces beyond human control or understanding. A few try to preserve the memory of what was lost, telling stories to their children and grandchildren, describing the wonders of Atlantis, the circular city with its orichalcum walls, the vast empire that ruled the ocean, the cataclysmic destruction that swallowed it all. But with each retelling, the stories become more distorted, more exaggerated, more confused. Details are forgotten or altered. Timelines are compressed or expanded. Within a few generations, the historical truth, if there ever was a historical truth, has been lost, replaced by myth and legend. And eventually, even the legends begin to fade, surviving only in the oral traditions of a few scattered communities, until finally they are recorded by the Egyptian priests in their temple archives, where they will wait for centuries until Solon comes to Sais and hears the story and brings it back to Greece, where it will eventually be immortalized in the dialogues of Plato. This is the story as Plato told it, the account preserved in his dialogues Timaeus and Critias. For more than 2,000 years, readers have grappled with a single question. Is it true? Did Atlantis really exist? Or was it merely a philosophical invention, a thought experiment, designed to illustrate the dangers of pride and the corruption of virtue? The question has never been definitively answered, and perhaps it never can be. Plato himself gives us no clear guidance. He insists through his narrator Critias that the story is entirely true, that it came from the most reliable sources, from Solon via the Egyptian priests. But Plato is a writer of philosophy, not of history. He is known for using myths and allegories to convey abstract ideas. The Republic, His most famous work contains the allegory of the cave, a story that everyone understands is not meant to be taken literally, but as a symbolic representation of the nature of knowledge and reality. The myth of which concludes the Republic, is another example of Plato using fictional narrative to illustrate philosophical points about the immortality of the soul and the consequences of moral choices. Could Atlantis be the same kind of allegory, a fictional story designed to make a philosophical point about the rise and fall of civilizations, about the dangers of imperialism and moral decay, about the inevitable punishment that awaits those who abandon justice and virtue? The question becomes even more complex when we consider what we know about Plato's sources and methods. Solon really existed. He was a historical figure, one of the great lawgivers of Athens who did indeed travel to Egypt around 600 before the Common Era. The city of Sais was a real place, and it did have a famous temple to the goddess Neith, where priests kept historical records and welcomed foreign visitors. But no Egyptian text has ever been found that mentions Atlantis or anything resembling Plato's account. The voluminous hieroglyphic records that have survived from ancient Egypt, thousands of inscriptions on temple walls and papyrus scrolls in archives, contain detailed accounts of wars, trade, diplomacy, and relations with foreign powers. But they never mention a great island empire in the Atlantic that attempted to conquer the Mediterranean world 9,000 years before Solon's visit. If such an empire had really existed, and if the Egyptians had really possessed records of it going back so far, we would expect to find some corroboration in their own writings, some independent confirmation of at least part of the story. The complete absence of such evidence is troubling for those who believe in a historical Atlantis. Moreover, there are elements in Plato's account that seem deliberately symbolic, almost too perfect to be historical. The circular city with its alternating rings of land and water, which creates a perfect geometric pattern, seems more like an ideal construct than a real city that would have grown organically over centuries. The three colors of stone, white and black and red, arranged in decorative patterns, seem symbolic of some philosophical or cosmological principle rather than a simple description of building materials. The mysterious metal orichalcum, which exists nowhere else and which gleams with an otherworldly light, seems more mythical than real. The number symbolism throughout the account, the 10 kings, the 5 pairs of twins, the precise dimensions of the plain and the city, all suggest careful construction rather than historical record. The kings who are descended from Poseidon, who possess divine blood, who live longer and are wiser than ordinary mortals, are clearly mythological figures rather than historical persons. Even the name Atlantis, which is transparently derived from Atlas, the Titan who holds up the sky in Greek mythology and who was associated with the far west and the ocean, seems more literary than historical. All of these details suggest a carefully constructed allegory rather than a genuine historical record. And yet, despite these doubts, despite the lack of corroborating evidence, despite the implausibilities and impossibilities in the account, the story has an extraordinary power that has captivated the imagination of every age since Plato first committed it to writing. In the centuries after Plato's death, other ancient writers began to comment on the Atlantis story, and their reactions were varied and often contradictory. Aristotle, Plato's most famous student and the man who studied at the academy for 20 years, apparently dismissed the story as a fiction invented by his teacher. According to later sources, Aristotle said that the man who invented Atlantis also destroyed it, suggesting that he understood the story to be a deliberate creation rather than a historical account. However, Aristotle's own writings on the subject have not survived, so we must rely on later reports of what he said, and these reports may not be entirely accurate. Other ancient philosophers took the story more seriously. Crantor, a philosopher who lived about a century after Plato, reportedly traveled to Egypt to investigate the story and claimed that the Egyptian priests confirmed its truth, showing him columns in the temple at Sais on which the account was inscribed. However, no other ancient writer mentions seeing these columns, and modern scholars are skeptical of Crantor's claim. The geographer Strabo, writing in the 1st century before the Common Era, discussed Atlantis in his comprehensive work on geography. He seemed uncertain whether to treat it as history or fiction, noting that many scholars accepted the story as true, while others dismissed it as invention. Strabo himself leaned toward skepticism, though he acknowledged that large islands could indeed sink into the sea, citing examples from his own time. Pliny the Elder, the Roman encyclopedist who compiled a massive work on natural history, described various islands in the Atlantic Ocean but never mentioned Atlantis. This silence is significant, for Pliny was exhaustive in his cataloguing of geographical knowledge, and if he had believed Atlantis to be real, he surely would have included it in his work. Plutarch, the Greek biographer and philosopher who lived in the 1st and 2nd centuries of the Common Era, discussed Plato's dialogues extensively in his own works, but expressed no clear opinion on whether Atlantis was historical. He seemed more interested in the moral and philosophical lessons of the story than in its literal truth. The early Christians, by and large, rejected the story of Atlantis as pagan mythology incompatible with biblical accounts of history. Augustine of Hippo, one of the most influential early Christian theologians, never mentioned Atlantis in his extensive writings, though he was familiar with Plato's works. The general Christian view was that the Atlantic Ocean could not have contained a great island empire because such a place is not mentioned in the Bible, and if it had existed before the time of Noah, it would have been destroyed in the biblical flood rather than by some supposed punishment from Zeus and the pagan gods. This theological objection to the Atlantis story would dominate European thought for more than 1,000 years during the Middle Ages, when Christian doctrine shaped all intellectual discourse. For more than 1,000 years during the European Middle Ages, Atlantis was largely forgotten or ignored by scholars. The works of Plato were known only through fragments and summaries, and the full text of the Timaeus and Critias was not widely available in Western Europe. The few medieval scholars who encountered references to Atlantis in classical texts tended to dismiss it as a pagan fable, a story invented by the Greeks to glorify their own ancestors and to explain geological phenomena they did not understand. The medieval worldview, shaped by biblical chronology and Christian theology, left little room for ancient empires that existed 9,000 years before Solon's time. According to the calculations of medieval scholars based on biblical genealogies, the entire world had been created only about 6,000 years ago, which meant that Atlantis, if it had existed when Plato said it did, would have predated the creation itself, an obvious impossibility. When the texts of Plato were finally translated from Greek into Latin during the Renaissance, and then into the vernacular languages of Europe, a new generation of scholars encountered the Atlantis story for the first time or rediscovered it after centuries of neglect. They approached it with fresh eyes, unburdened by the accumulated skepticism of ancient commentators and free from some of the theological constraints that had bound medieval thought. The Renaissance was an age of exploration and discovery, a time when European navigators were sailing across the Atlantic Ocean, discovering new lands in the Americas, circumnavigating Africa, opening up trade routes to Asia. The world was suddenly much larger and stranger than medieval scholars had imagined. Maps that had been used for centuries were being redrawn, lands that had been considered mythical were being located and explored. Ancient texts that described unknown lands and lost civilizations took on new relevance and plausibility. If Columbus could sail across the ocean and find a previously unknown continent filled with cities and civilizations that had never been mentioned in European texts, perhaps Plato's account of Atlantis was not so implausible after all. Some Renaissance scholars began to speculate that the newly discovered Americas might actually be the remnants of Atlantis or lands that had been colonized by the Atlanteans. They noted that Plato had mentioned a great continent beyond Atlantis across the ocean, and they wondered whether this might be a reference to the Americas. They were struck by reports of advanced civilizations in Mexico and Peru, civilizations that had built great cities and monumental architecture without any apparent contact with Europe or Asia. How had these peoples developed such sophistication in isolation? One possible answer was that they were descended from Atlantean colonists, that they had inherited their knowledge and skills from that ancient empire. This theory had the appeal of explaining several mysteries at once: the origin of Native American civilizations, the purpose of Plato's dialogue, and the fate of Atlantis. It also fit with a Eurocentric worldview that found it difficult to believe that non-European peoples could have developed advanced civilizations independently. Francis Bacon, the English philosopher and statesman, published a utopian novel in 1626 titled The New Atlantis. In this work, Bacon described a fictional island in the Pacific Ocean that was inhabited by the descendants of the ancient Atlanteans. In Bacon's telling, Atlantis had not been entirely destroyed. A portion of the empire had survived the catastrophe, and its people had continued to develop their civilization in isolation. They had created an ideal society dedicated to scientific research and the systematic investigation of nature. The new Atlantis was not meant as a historical account but as a blueprint for an ideal scientific community, a vision of what human society could become if it were organized around the pursuit of knowledge rather than power or wealth. However, Bacon's work helped to revive interest in Plato's original story and to suggest that there might be some historical truth buried beneath the philosophical allegory. It also introduced the idea that Atlantis could serve as a model for future societies, a lost utopia that could be recreated through human effort and ingenuity. Around the same time, various European nations began to engage in what might be called patriotic scholarship, attempting to claim ancient glories for themselves and to argue that their own ancestors were the true inheritors of classical civilization. The Swedish scholar Olaus Rudbeck proposed in his massive work Atlantica, published between 1679 and 1702, that Atlantis had been located in Scandinavia and that the Atlanteans were the ancestors of the Swedish people. Rudbeck marshaled an impressive array of linguistic, mythological, and geographical evidence to support his theory, arguing that the names in Plato's account could be traced to Swedish place names and that the geography of Sweden matched Plato's description. His work was enormously popular in Sweden, where it fed national pride, but it was dismissed by scholars in other countries as fanciful speculation driven by patriotic bias rather than rigorous analysis. Similar theories were proposed by scholars in other countries, each claiming that Atlantis had been located in their own nation or that their own ancestors were the true Atlanteans. The 18th century saw continued speculation about Atlantis, but it also saw the beginning of more systematic and scientific approaches to the question. As geology developed as a discipline, scholars began to understand that the Earth had a long history of dramatic changes, that continents had shifted, that sea levels had risen and fallen, that catastrophic events had reshaped the planet many times over millions of years. This new geological knowledge seemed to provide a framework for understanding how a large island could have sunk into the ocean. The discovery of fossils of marine creatures on mountaintops, the recognition that volcanic eruptions and earthquakes could cause massive changes in short periods of time, all of this seemed to support the plausibility of Plato's account. If the Earth's surface was not stable but had been repeatedly transformed by natural forces, then perhaps a large island in the Atlantic had indeed existed and had been destroyed by some catastrophic geological event. However, the same geological knowledge also created problems for the Atlantis theory. As geologists mapped the floor of the Atlantic Ocean and studied the structure of the Earth's crust, they found no evidence of a sunken continent or large island in the locations where Atlantis was supposed to have been. The Mid-Atlantic Ridge, a vast underwater mountain range that runs down the center of the Atlantic, was briefly thought to be a possible remnant of Atlantis, but detailed studies showed that it had been underwater for millions of years, long before the evolution of human beings. The ocean floor turned out to be far more stable than early theorists had hoped, and the geological evidence simply did not support the existence of a large landmass that had sunk within the timeframe suggested by Plato's account. The person who did more than anyone else to embed Atlantis in the modern popular imagination, to transform it from an obscure reference in ancient philosophy into a cultural phenomenon known to people around the world, was an American politician and amateur scholar named Ignatius Donnelly. Donnelly was a congressman from Minnesota, a reformer and populist who was involved in many of the political controversies of his time. But his enduring fame comes not from his political career but from a book he published in 1882 titled Atlantis, the Antediluvian World. This book became an immediate bestseller, went through numerous editions, and has never been out of print since. Donnelly argued with great passion and apparent erudition that Atlantis was not a myth but a historical fact, a real civilization that had existed in the Atlantic Ocean and had been the source of all later advanced civilizations. According to Donnelly's theory, the Atlanteans had invented all the fundamental technologies and institutions of civilization: agriculture, writing, metallurgy, architecture, law, religion. They had sailed across the ocean in both directions, establishing colonies in Europe, Africa, and the Americas. When Atlantis was destroyed by a catastrophic volcanic explosion and subsequent flooding, the survivors fled to these colonies, bringing with them the seeds of civilization. This theory, Donnelly argued, explained numerous mysteries and puzzles that had long vexed scholars. It explained the striking similarities between the pyramids of Egypt and the pyramids of Mexico and Central America. It explained why so many ancient cultures had similar myths about a great flood that destroyed an earlier civilization. It explained the distribution of certain plants and animals that appeared on both sides of the Atlantic. It explained why ancient cultures separated by thousands of miles of ocean had similar religious symbols and architectural styles. It explained legends of ancient wisdom and lost golden ages that appeared in cultures around the world. All of these similarities and parallels, Donnelly insisted, could not be coincidence. They must be the result of a common source, a mother civilization from which all the others had sprung, and that mother civilization was Atlantis. Donnelly marshaled an impressive array of evidence in support of his theory. He drew on mythology from cultures around the world, pointing out common themes and motifs that suggested shared origins. He cited geological evidence of catastrophic changes in the Earth's history. He analyzed linguistic similarities between ancient languages, arguing that they derived from a common Atlantean tongue. He examined archaeological discoveries, interpreting ancient ruins and artifacts as evidence of Atlantean influence. He constructed elaborate charts and tables showing parallels between different civilizations. The sheer volume of evidence he presented was overwhelming, and many readers found his arguments convincing. However, most of his evidence was misinterpreted, taken out of context, or simply wrong. The similarities between Egyptian and American pyramids, for example, are superficial. They were built at different times using different techniques for different purposes. The flood myths that appear in many cultures can be explained by the fact that most civilizations developed in river valleys where flooding was a common and devastating occurrence, not by reference to a single prehistoric catastrophe. The linguistic similarities Donnelly identified were either coincidental or the result of more recent contact between cultures, not evidence of a shared Atlantean origin. Something about the image of a great civilization destroyed in a single cataclysmic event resonates deeply with the human psyche. It taps into primal fears of natural disaster, of divine punishment, of the fragility of even the mightiest empires. It speaks to a universal human experience, the knowledge that all things, no matter how powerful or beautiful, are ultimately temporary and subject to forces beyond human control. It reminds us that civilizations rise and fall, that prosperity can vanish overnight, that the works of human hands are vulnerable to the terrible power of nature and the judgment of the gods. In every generation, people have looked at the ruins of past civilizations and wondered what happened, how such great achievements could have been lost, whether the same fate awaits their own society. And in Atlantis they have found a story that gives shape and meaning to these fears, that transforms them into a narrative with moral and philosophical significance. And so our story of Atlantis comes to a close. We have traveled from the Academy of Plato to the shores of the ocean beyond the world. We have walked the circular streets of the imagined city and watched it sink beneath the waves. We have followed the searchers and the dreamers through the centuries, each generation adding its own layer of meaning to the ancient tale. We have seen how the legend reflects both the realities of the human past and the timeless patterns of human nature. The sea keeps its secrets, and if Atlantis ever existed, those secrets are buried deep beneath the waves, beyond the reach of our searching. But the story itself needs no physical evidence to justify its existence. It endures because it is true in a deeper sense, true to the human experience of loss and longing, true to the pattern of rise and fall that has shaped every civilization that has ever existed. As you drift towards sleep tonight, let the image of Atlantis settle in your mind. See the golden city shining in the sun, hear the wash of waves against its circular shores, feel the weight of centuries bearing down on that impossible place. And remember that all things pass, all things change, but the stories we tell about ourselves and our world, those stories endure. They carry us forward through time, connecting past and future, linking one generation to the next. The story of Atlantis, like the sea itself, is eternal, ever-changing, yet always the same. Thank you for joining me on this journey through myth and memory. Sleep well, and may your dreams be filled with the wonders of lost worlds and distant ages, where the line between history and imagination fades like mist on the morning sea.